Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well, inshallah. This video is a continuation to the last video about the Anglo-Saxon literature. The first video was entitled Historical, Social and Literary Background. It discussed mainly the relationship of the literature of the Old English period to the times and the historical aspects that contributed in creating this kind of literary tradition. Today's video is about the writings that were written during the time, and more specifically, it is about the prose verse writing during these Anglo-Saxon times. In this short video, I'll try to emphasize on the main writings and poems that were written both in verse and prose, and the main writers writing them. Most of the poems and historical or religious writings of the Anglo-Saxon literature were originally found in the Exeter Book from 900 AD. The book is an anthology of manuscripts that included and still include pieces of the Old English tradition around 900 CE. The Exeter Book consists of 131 leaves of parchment, and it belonged originally to some bishop known as Leofric or Lofric. This Lofric, the bishop of the Exeter Cathedral, donated his book to its library in the times between 1050 and 1072. The Exeter Book doesn't only include the religious, historical, and verse writings, but also it includes some pieces of advice of how to live a good life, how to start a home, and how to be good to people. It includes remedies and also some riddles that were really important in the oral tradition at the time. Because of the fact that the Anglo-Saxon poetry was rooted in its tradition, the Anglo-Saxon oral poets were minstrels who would disengage themselves from the tribal life and travel, wandering from place to place in order to chant, sing, and recite poetry to people using a musical instrument similar to the harp. These Anglo-Saxon scops, or often called shops or gleemen, were meant to describe the legends and stories of the heroes that were currently living or lived centuries ago. In every culture that we know, these oral poets existed, and they contributed in the social development, because the minstrel would help transfer a kind of poetic tradition to the people, and he helps to create a kind of heroic culture, or maybe a religious culture, that was built by reference to society and history. The oral poets were very significant, especially in the battlefield, where they were meant to encourage warriors by reciting the stories of battles from legendary times. Religious poetry is a significant form during the Anglo-Saxon literature or the Anglo-Saxon period. One of the main poems in the religious tradition of the Anglo-Saxon is known as the Dream of the Rood. The rood here means the cross. The Dream of the Rood is considered a lyric, and it's seen as the finest religious poem in the English language from that period. It was said that it was attributed to either Caedmon or Beowulf, but then, because of its runic writing, they considered that it is an anonymous poem similar to many poems found in the Exeter Book. So this Dream of the Rood, a poet describes the experience of Jesus, peace be upon him, once being crucified. Of course, in Christianity, they believe that Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, was crucified, but in Islam, of course, we know that this is not true. But I'm just transferring to you that culture and that tradition and describing the theme of the poem. So the poet describes really the experience and the pain and the suffering that the piece of wood by which the cross was made felt and shared with the prophet, peace be upon him, when being tortured. So the Dream of the Rood describes a kind of a dream to this cross, to this rood, because it has experienced the pain of a prophet, a pain of a man who was considered to them a lord or a saint or something glorious and holy. This Dream of the Rood poem was discovered in the 8th century, and it was considered to be from Scotland or Ireland, maybe, because of the runic inscriptions that were similar to the Ruthwell cross on your right. Religious and historical prose was also important during the time. One of the most significant scribes or writers of the era was King Alfred the Great, who was both a king and a writer. We have also two poets by the name of Beowulf and Caedmon. We have Bede the Venerable, and of course the scribe Aldhelm, that was the student of Adrian the African. These religious scribes depicted the Christian literature of the Anglo-Saxon in diverse types, because they described the lives of saints, of prophets, of many historical and heroic figures of the time. And they also focused mainly on biblical stories as well as on history, similar to Bede the Venerable, who described and spoke about and write about the way the English people were Christianized. Every religious writer of the time was significant and is still significant, but the ones who were more approachable were mainly Caedmon, because he was considered the first poet ever existed in the English tradition, in the English language, and his Caedmon's hymn is considered the first fragment ever found in literature. Also, Saint Bede the Venerable, who was an Anglo-Saxon theologian, historian, and chronologist, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, where he didn't only describe information but also analyzed it and explained it. And he focused on the history of conversion from paganism to Christianity. Moving now to another poetic form, which is the elegy. Elegies generally are known to be monologues that were recited without knowing the poet attributed to them. So this unnamed person would imply his situation through the tone and through the use of adjectives and words that would lead us to understand his situation, his experiences, and his feelings. So these elegies would focus on passionate feelings that were voiced in a desolate landscape. We will always have someone who is lamenting and mourning his life in a desolate place, an isolated landscape similar to a wood or sea. For example, in the ancient times, elegies referred to love poems where someone would lament, mourn, or cry over their loved ones. But generally, during the modern time, they are now described as formal lamenting poems which engrave and depict sorrow and mourning for the lost ones, loved ones, or for life tragedies and calamities. The Seafarer, for example, is an example of these elegiac poems. The Seafarer describes an old sailor who speaks of terror and wonder, and he is telling us his experiences and help us or engages us to experience his past glory. So the poem is considered both lyrical and elegiac. The Seafarer and the Wanderer, which is another poem of a similar tone and theme, are both passionate and eloquent in language. They are self-explanatory and they describe inner thoughts, experiences, pain and suffering, the feeling of loss and exile. They are similar to the soliloquy, which is lines presented by a character to express his or her inner thoughts. These soliloquies were used in dramatic poetry during the 16th century, especially in the Elizabethan and the Jacobean theatres. The epic is another important form of poetry in the Anglo-Saxon period because it depicts the stories of historical events and legends who were considered cultural icons and of a cultural importance. The epic was originated from Greece, and it was mainly orally expressed. It was recited. So you would feel the tone, you would feel the power of the words when the poetic form is better recited. And here I think the importance of the oral poet would appear, because that kind of feeling of glory, of pain, would only show from the way this minstrel would express and utter his words to the people and to the ones listening to him. Many Old English poems during the time would definitely diverge both in theme and form. For example, we can find one poem that is epic, heroic, and elegiac. The famous example that we can give is the poem Beowulf, which doesn't only describe a monster-slaying hero and the defeats and triumphs of the battlefield, but it also speaks of a person, a man who is eventually sacrificing his life because it is his fate to do so. We experience a person speaking about his past glories, his youth, and his joyful life that he once had when he was a warrior, a seafarer, traveling from place to place. So the lamenting aspect in the poem would certainly show, because poems are generally not only about showing the external side of things, namely loyalty, bravery, and tribal power, but also they would introject and reflect upon the inner reality of the human being that is only known in the tone and the mood of the poet. Battle poetry was also important, and it was also another form during the Anglo-Saxon period. It was recited and chanted mainly by warriors themselves before battles or in their way to battle. So battle poetry was also often chanted by minstrels who would accompany those warriors to the battlefield, or also in courts where the meeting place and the mead halls would include warlords and kings. Here the minstrel would celebrate and praise that warrior king for gold, for money, for favor and position. The mead hall poetry is also called courtly poetry because it was recited inside courts, and these epic poems or elegiac poems were often recited by royal scopes. This royal scope or shop, reciting the heroic tradition, would follow a biographical form and style in pattern in order to tell the glories and triumphs of this hero. So all these poems, for example, either being epic, heroic, elegiac, would describe how did a Viking or a Saxon or a Norseman live in the time of dangers, sailing at sea, or wandering in the woods. They also focus mainly on the idea of weird. This weird means fate. Destiny here for any man, for any warrior during the Anglo-Saxon times, was to obey the code of honor and loyalty, and accept his destiny by dying for his people and sacrificing his life for the tribe and for the king or warlord. But they also highlight and focus on the aspect of feelings because it is important. Sometimes they describe anguish, the feeling of collapse, in the so-called fatalistic life, because no matter how life could be enjoyable, it is eventually going to ashes. Any man, especially by reference to the Christian and the religious tradition in general, would know that all those glories and joys of life and materialistic aspects of life would eventually fade, and any man, no matter how strong or powerful he might be, he would, by the end of his time, by the end of time, age and shrink into a weak, needy person who would only hope and grasp his Master Lord, glory and forgiveness and mercy. This is all for now. I hope you find this useful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment on the comment section below or contact me on my email address. Inshallah. Keep safe.